Imagine being nailed alive to your own deck for 6 days. What Golden Age pirates truly endured. When their own crew turned against them at sea, marooning by comparison was called an act of mercy. Picture the scene. A single figure stands on a sliver of white sand as the tide slowly rises. Behind him, a longboat rows toward a black-hulled ship growing smaller with every stroke of the oars. In his hand, a flintlock pistol. In his belt, a flask of brackish water. On his tongue, salt. And something colder, relief. Because what truly waited aboard the ship was infinitely, unspeakably worse than this. To understand why marooning was called mercy, we must first understand the word that made such claim possible. The Golden Age of Piracy spanned roughly 80 years, from about 1650 to 1730 on European seas. It was born in the wake of European wars, when kings dismissed their privateers and left them adrift.
Thousands of trained killers cast loose with nothing but ships, gunpowder, and grievance against the crowns that betrayed them. They drifted south, they drifted east. They found the Caribbean, the Atlantic trade lanes, and Indian Ocean coasts. Madagascar, Malabar, distant shores beyond the reach of any king. And there, under the black flag, they rose. Their harbours were the blood-soaked ports of the age, havens where fortune favoured the ruthless above all. Port Royal, on the coast of Jamaica, called the wickedest city on earth until the sea swallowed it. In 1692, an earthquake pulled Port Royal beneath the waves, drowning its taverns, its gold, its sins. Nassau, on New Providence, ungoverned and open, a republic of thieves under captains like Hornigold and Vane. Tortuga of Hispaniola, where French buccaneers first learned to smoke meat over green wood on iron grates.
They gave their name to the trade, buccaneers, the smokers of flesh, hunters turned raiders of the sea. In these smoke-hazed harbours, no admiralty court held sway, and no crown ever reached beneath the black flag. The only law aboard was the law the crew wrote for itself. Brutal, lawless, ruthless, and free. And that law was written in blood. Every ship under the black flag carried articles signed by every hand aboard. These articles fixed the share of plunder, the compensation for a lost limb, the punishment for every crime aboard. Theft, cowardice, desertion, concealment of loot, striking a fellow crewman. For each offense, a tariff was set, and the tariff was rarely gentle. Their laws were written in blood and enforced in something far worse. Here lies the paradox that shapes this story. Marooning, the punishment Hollywood taught us to fear above all, was in truth the softest sentence a pirate court could hand down. The condemned man was granted 3 things: a pistol loaded with a single ball, a flask of fresh water, a small measure of powder and shot. He was left on a shore, sometimes an island, sometimes only a sandbar that vanished beneath the waves. He was given the tools to feed himself, defend himself, or, if hope collapsed entirely, end himself. This was the mercy trio: the pistol, the bottle, the shore. Because everything else in the pirate code took longer, hurt more, and ended worse. Marooning left the outcome to fate and to the man himself. What came next left nothing at all. The first entry in the catalogue never left a body to bury. Consider the lash. The cat o' nine tails was a whip of 9 knotted cords, each tipped with lead or bone. Bound to a handle wrapped in red cloth so blood would not show. The number 9 was no decoration. A single stroke laid 9 wounds across the back. A dozen strokes stripped a man of his skin. 2 dozen exposed the ribs. And the sentence rarely stopped at 2 dozen. Naval floggings routinely reached 100. Pirate crews, less bound by admiralty custom, sometimes doubled it. 200 lashes down a ribboned back. But the pain of the lash was not the worst of it. The surgeon's brine came next.
When the flogging ended, the surgeon washed the raw wounds with brine, vinegar, or rum mixed with gunpowder. The salt drove into torn flesh to slow infection, but drove the condemned men to screaming hurt shipwide. Men flogged aboard pirate vessels sometimes lived, many did not. Fever took them within a week of the ordeal. And still, this was not the worst the ship could do. Keel hauling was the older, colder cruelty. It came from the Dutch navy of the 17th century, and pirate crews borrowed it under the black flag. The condemned man was stripped, bound at wrists and ankles, and lashed to a rope threaded beneath the keel. He was thrown overboard, then hauled, slowly, deliberately, beneath the entire length of the wooden hull. The keel was never smooth. It wore barnacles sharp as flint, hardened by years, steeped in cold, salt water. They tore the flesh from a man's chest and belly as he was dragged across their jagged crust. If pulled quickly, the barnacles carved him open.
If pulled slowly, the seawater filled his drowning lungs. Some captains ordered him hold the full length. Others ordered him hold from bow to stern and back again. Very few survived the second passage. Those who did were often blind, their eyes torn out by the hull. Yet these, brutal as they were, remained the punishments a man might still somehow survive under the black flag. There was another, subtler cruelty aboard, the sweating. The condemned man stood at the center of the deck. Around him, in a tight ring, the crew drew their cutlasses, and they forced him to dance. Every time his feet slowed, a blade pricked his back, his thighs, or the soles of his feet. He danced until he could no longer stand. Then he danced on his knees. Then he collapsed. Sometimes the crew let him rise, sometimes they did not. The ship itself had become the instrument. The deck, the rigging, the very timbers turned against the men who had once called them home.
And still we have not reached the worst of it. For all their horror, these tortures were survivable. The lash, the keel, the sweating, men lived to sail again after them. That was the point. The punishments were meant to break the man, not to kill him. Killing wasted a working hand aboard. Not until you reached the shore and the deeper terrors beyond it did the code turn truly final. So let us return to marooning and see it now for what it truly was. The ritual was ceremonial. The articles were read aloud on deck. The verdict of the crew was solemnly announced to all. The pistol was loaded in full view. The powder horn was measured. The water flask was filled. The condemned man was rowed slowly to the shore, sometimes with a small kit of ship's biscuit, sometimes with nothing but the pistol and the flask. And then the longboat pulled quietly away from him. The shore itself was rarely the lush green paradise of the sailors' storybooks and grand adventure tales.
More often a sandbar in a lagoon, a spit of coral no larger than a small house, a bare rock exposed only at low tide. The idea was never to give the marooned man a home. The idea was to give him a stage, a lonely stage on which to face himself at last. And yet, men survived. Alexander Selkirk, Scottish sailing master, marooned on Mazatierra in 1704. He lived alone for 4 years and 4 months before an English ship at last recovered him. He hunted goats, built 2 huts, read his Bible aloud daily to keep the sound of a human voice. His story reached London and became the seed of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, a castaway born from real horror. Edward England, Irish captain of the Fancy, marooned by his own crew on Mauritius for sparing an English merchant. With a handful of loyal men, he built a raft from driftwood and sailed all the way to Madagascar. There he lived on, poor, broken, but alive, until fever and disease finally took him from the world. Marooning could be endured. It could be beaten. Crews called it sometimes a second chance under the black flag, because the alternative began with a rope and a yardarm. the fate that pirates feared beyond dying itself. We turn now to what happened once the breath had left the body, the terror reaching into eternity. This was the punishment the English crown reserved for its greatest enemies at sea, and it was called gibbeting. Gibbeting was not execution. Execution came first. The gibbet was the slow, terrible ritual that followed the drop. After the pirate was hanged, his body was cut down and dipped in hot tar against rot and gulls. Then it was locked inside an iron cage shaped roughly to the shape of a human form. The cage hung from a wooden post on a headland, a river mouth, the approach to a great port. There it hung, for years. Sometimes for decades, a silent warning to any who sailed beneath the black flag. Captain William Kidd, the Scottish privateer turned pirate, was hanged at Execution Dock in May of 1701. His body was then carried down the Thames to Tilbury Point and hung in irons above the estuary. For more than 20 years, every ship entering the port of London passed beneath his tarred form. Sailors on the incoming tide looked up and saw him, a warning against the black flag itself. To the pirate mind, this was worse than the noose. A body denied burial meant a soul denied rest. No consecrated ground, no Christian rite, no hope of resurrection with the body intact. A final erasure. The empire had learned that a man who did not fear death still feared the disgrace that outlasted it. The gibbet made a corpse into a sermon, and every incoming sail read it clearly in the wind. And here we must correct a myth that has run untouched for nearly 3 centuries under the black flag.
The plank. That cinematic punishment, the blindfolded captive walking backward toward the sea, is nearly pure invention. There are almost no reliable historical accounts of Golden Age pirates forcing prisoners to walk any such plank. It appears in a handful of 19th century novels, and from there in every pirate film that followed. The gibbet was real, the plank was pure fiction. Hollywood chose the gentler lie, and the truth stayed buried. And the crown was not the only jailer of the dead. Pirates jailed and tortured their own. Beyond the reach of any admiralty, pirate-on-pirate cruelty reached depths that made the gibbet itself look civil. Edward Teach, whom the world remembers as Blackbeard, once sat drinking below deck with 2 of his officers. Without warning, he drew 2 pistols beneath the table, crossed his arms under it, and fired both at once. One ball went wide. The other struck Israel Hands, his own quartermaster, in the knee, crippling him forever.
When the crew asked why, he answered, and the words survive, with terrible honesty concerning his men. If he did not shoot one of his own now and then, they would forget exactly who he was. Cruelty aboard such a ship was not indulgence. It was command, the only currency a black flag captain trusted. Edward Lowe was worse. A New England pirate of the 1720s remembered for the imagination of his torments. He tied lit fuses between the fingers of captive merchants, burning them slowly to the very bone. He cut the lips from a Portuguese captain, cooked them before the man's eyes, and forced him to eat, then killed him. Lowe worked with George Lowther, another captain of the same brutal school of pirate cruelty. Between them, they left mutilated survivors along the American coast, a horror Boston's papers could scarcely print. There was a torment called woulding. A length of cord was wound around the victim's skull above the eyes. It was tightened slowly, with a stick twisted through it, as one tightens a tourniquet on a wound. The pressure crushed the temples. The eyes bulged from their sockets. Some men died beneath the woulding. Some talked. Those who talked and lived rarely saw again, for beneath the black flag, fortune favored the ruthless. And there was the punishment for informers, men who had betrayed their crew and were later recaptured by authorities. Their tongues were cut out at the root. Their ears were nailed to the mainmast in brutal display. They were set adrift in a small boat with no oars and no water to die of thirst. This was cruelty as currency. A captain who could not inflict it lost his ship to his own crew. But one punishment terrified even the cruelest captain under the black flag, a fate spoken of in whispers. That punishment waited at the head of narrow stone steps on the north bank of the Thames. In the parish of Wapping, in the east of London, the stairs descended to a low mudflat, where the river ran shallow at low tide. Above the stairs stood a wooden gallows painted black. The place bore a name that every man under the black flag knew and dreaded: Execution Dock. Execution Dock was the appointed place for the hanging of pirates convicted by the High Court of Admiralty. Its jurisdiction was the sea, and by tradition its sentences were carried out at the low water mark. At the very edge of the tide, where the sea and the land met in solemn ceremony, so that neither the earth nor the ocean could rightfully claim the crime as fully its own. The procession began at Marshalsea Prison in Southwark, the condemned carried slowly in an open wooden cart, escorted by the Deputy Marshal of the Admiralty bearing a silver oar, the emblem of maritime authority. The route ran across Old London Bridge through the city and eastward along the wharves toward Wapping. Crowds lined the road. Ale was sold. Ballads were printed and hawked for a single copper penny.
At the dock, the hanging itself was designed to be slow. This was the essential deliberate cruelty. Naval hangings elsewhere in the 18th century used the long drop, a fall that broke the neck cleanly. Death came in seconds. But execution dock, by ancient design, used a different method, the short drop. The condemned stood on a stool or on the tailboard of the cart. The rope was tightened, the stool was kicked away. The fall was perhaps a single foot. The neck did not break. Instead, the man strangled, kicking for a quarter of an hour. The crowds called this dance the marshal's jig. When at last the body ceased to twitch, it was not cut down. It was left in place. And here the ritual of execution dock became something older than justice, older than the crown itself. By ancient admiralty custom, a pirate hanged at Wapping remained suspended until 3 tides had washed over him, 3 risings of the Thames, 3 coverings of the corpse by the very river he had once fled. Only then was he cut down. If he had been a captain of note, his body was taken downriver. There gibbeted at Tilbury or at Bugsby's Reach, left to hang until the iron cage rusted through. They died on the same rope. John Rackham, called Calico Jack, hanged at Port Royal in 1720. His body was gibbeted afterward on a small Jamaican island that still bears his name to this day. William Kidd hanged at Execution Dock in 1701. The rope broke on the first attempt. He had to climb the scaffold a second time before the roaring crowd to be hanged again. Charles Vane, the last captain of Nassau to defy the pardon of the crown, hanged at Gallows Point. In 1721, after the same slow ceremony, his body dressed the harbour as a warning to all. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, hanged in Charleston in 1718, a bouquet of wildflowers in his shaking hands. The list runs on. The rope was the same. Their bodies became the empire's warning under the black flag. This was the true terror under the black flag. Not the pistol on the sandbar, not the lash. The terror was the long walk from Marshalsea, the silver oar carried before you through the jeering crowd. The stool was kicked, the slow kick of your own legs, the 3 tides, the tar, the iron cage. Years of sailors passing beneath, the wind, the gulls. This was the fate that turned Marooning into mercy. So how did we forget? How did the plank replace the gibbet, the desert island replace the tarred cage? The answer begins in 1883 with a novel called Treasure Island by Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson gave us Long John Silver, the parrot, the black spot, doubloons, and the map with the red cross. He also made the plank famous. Every pirate novel after him borrowed the image. Every stage adaptation used it. When the moving picture arrived,
the plank stepped from the page directly onto the screen and never left. Hollywood, for its part, chose romance over record. The gibbet was too grim, the three tides too slow. The short drop at Execution Dock did not fit inside a matinee, so pirates' true fears were quietly cut. What remained was buried treasure, the eye patch, the parrot and the plank, the sanitized silhouette of piracy. The truth behind the myth was left to rot on the mudflats of Wapping, unvisited by the cameras. A deeper reason exists. The pirate code, in its own strange way, mirrored the admiralty law it defied. It fixed shares, it fixed compensation, it fixed punishment. It was, in miniature, a system of justice. And like every system of justice, it reserved its greatest cruelties for those who broke it from within. Marooning survives in the romantic imagination because it leaves the ending open. A shored man may yet be saved. A man in a cage above the Thames may not. We prefer the open ending. We always have. But the record is clear. Marooning was mercy. The pistol was mercy. The glass bottle, too, was mercy. Even the lash, in its way, was mercy. What men beneath the black flag truly feared was different. They feared the slow rope at Wapping, the free tides at their feet, iron above the estuary. Iron that held them long after their crews had scattered and their ships had rotted at anchor. The black flag flew shorter than the ropes that followed. Their brutal age lasted only 80 years. Their bodies hung, some of them, for 20. The empire outlived them and remembered them as warnings, as sermons in tar, as lessons to every sailor who might look up from his hammock and dream. Any sailor who might, for a single moment, think of raising a black cloth to the masthead. And yet, for all the ropes and all the cages, some of them chose otherwise entirely. Some, when the moment came, drew the pistol on the shore. They spent the single ball on themselves, rather than face the marshal's silver oar. One captain, above all others, made that final ruthless choice. In a small cabin on a burning ship, with the sound of boarders on the deck above him, his name and the manner of his ending is a story reserved entirely for the next voyage. If you want to know how that captain met his end, the next video is already waiting. If you want to know how that captain met his end, the man who chose pistol over noose. The next video is already waiting on the channel. Subscribe and raise the black flag with us. There are more stories beneath the waves. Join the crew, set sail with us. The next voyage begins. The moment you press the button, the tide rises. The black flag climbs.